Force as part of the effort to coordinate a statewide response to the urgent crisis of Indigenous people who go missing or are victims of homicide or experience other types of gender-based violence in urban and tribal communities. Across our country, the first National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls is May 5th, and it started in 2017. Rallies and workshops occur nationwide to bring the tragedy of our MMIWG sisters to the forefront. Tammy Aarons of the Yakima Herald, who has been a champion in reporting on the MMIWG issue, wrote, "Still, much work needs to be done. Many questions must be answered. It's a start that encourages those who are still wondering what happened to their their loved ones, and it's hope to save others. They are murdered and missing Native women. They are our girls, they are our mothers, they are our grandmothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, and friends. They have names, and they have stories, and they are no longer invisible." Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm very happy to field some. Yes.
What can we do to help?
I think, thank you. That is such a question that I want to say anything and everything. But the most important thing is, I believe, is to make sure that, for instance, on May 5th, which is coming up here soon, contact the Yakima Reservation and see what their task force is setting up for recognition and awareness for murdered and missing Indigenous women. Bring that into our community, because we all know that there's those problems out there too. Those statistics that I gave you a little bit ago really are just the tip of the iceberg. They say that there's just thousands more murdered and missing. But what happens is, very often, especially families, this is such a painful thing for the families to have to live through and work through, that very often they don't do the reporting like they should. The other thing too is Native people migrate. Very often they migrate between tribes, they migrate between reservations, and so when the family does go to an agency and say that their sister or their mother has disappeared, very often the agency will say, "Oh, she'll show up. She's probably on the Umatilla, or she's probably on the Silex. You know, the first thing I'll ask is, do you have relatives on another reservation?" And if you say, yeah, I do, in Cheyenne River, well, she'll show up there soon. She'll show up there sooner or later, and they won't follow up on those. And so I believe, you know, it's such an open-ended thing to do, but, you know, just bringing that awareness, making sure that those of you who have the contacts and our law enforcement and our cities, city councils members, making sure that they recognize this problem does exist here in Ellensburg, and it exists on every community around, and it's up to us to make sure that law enforcement and those in authority will follow up and make sure that there's support and understanding for those families who need that.
Wasn't an Amber Alert recently passed?
Yes. Yes, one of 3 legislative actions this year was an Amber Alert, for indigenous women and missing persons, was passed and signed by Governor Inslee that will give notification when there is a missing or murdered, missing person that's reported there. So yes. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of confusion too happens with who has the jurisdiction to investigate. And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little, wondering if the Washington Task Force takes that into account or...
Yes. In the late 1800s, when Native Americans were being put out onto reservations, were being put into reservations boundaries, Native Americans were specified or classified, the tribes were classified as sovereign nations, which meant that they have their own, their tribal police have their own jurisdiction there, and it is very often used as an excuse for outside county, city, outside law enforcement to excuse to use not to go onto the reservation to investigate. Now, I read a quote there where the treaties actually say they may, and if upon them being asked to do that, they are obligated to go onto the reservations, but unfortunately with that wording, they may get involved. They use that very often to not go onto reservations and work with the tribal police. And the tribal police really are not funded adequately to really follow up on this type of crime, and so unfortunately that's why many of the cases go cold, because they're just kind of bounced around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it comes back to that whole sovereign nation terminology in the treaties that were let in the late 1800s.
Are there other state level laws or funding changes or policy changes that are in the works, or that we ought to be, encouraging representatives to support?
That task force that was set up, please get in. They're wonderful, wonderful websites for that task force. You just go into the washington.gov and you can find those websites in there, or that website, and they give, there's a eastern and a western representative on that task force, and those are people that we need to contact, and they would be the ones that would know what needs to be done and how we can help, get the word out or to do whatever. I do want to go back to one point on the sovereign nation. The FBI, the only other entity, unless actually introduced into the crime resolution, the FBI, since it's a national agency, is the one agency, federal agency, that will come in to the reservations to help. But they're sorely underfunded and stretched widely. I think the last I heard out of the Seattle FBI office, there is only like 3 FBI agents, something like that, that are there to be able to handle this type of missing and homicide cases.